Hello, and welcome to Charted, Astrology podcast. My name's James, and today we're going to talk about Pluto and what it represents both individually and collectively in astrology. So Pluto is the last planet we're going to look at in this series. I don't want to say it's the last planet in the solar system. As a millennial, right, growing up, that's obviously what I was taught. Now we have since discovered things beyond Pluto. It also got demoted. It's now a dwarf planet, which for astrology purposes is irrelevant. We could call it whatever we want. But at the end of the day, astrology is about watching all of these cycles and observing them and essentially matching how they correlate with us on a personal level, on a collective level. It's a study of time, really. It's what astrology is about. And so whether we label things one way or another doesn't change the fact that those cycles exist and continue. So, yeah, whether it's dwarf planet or not, it's irrelevant, at least astrologically. That being said, right, let's look at the discovery of this dwarf planet. Get a sense for what happened, because it's a generational planet, which means it was discovered. Right, it was discovered in 1930. And what happened? Just like with Uranus and Neptune, its discovery kind of has some of the elements of what it represents, and so that's why we want to look at it. It's just kind of an interesting example. So we had the discovery of Uranus, very sudden, unexpected. Then with Neptune, they noticed, right, mathematically the orbits people had projected for Uranus weren't fitting, and so they thought, okay, there must be some other planet influencing it through its gravity. And sure enough, after much ado about that, they eventually found Neptune. And then in the late 1890s, there was a man named Percival Lowell, and he had an observatory in the U.S. somewhere, and he had noticed that, again, there was some kind of perturbation in the orbit of Uranus. And so he theorized there was another planet out beyond Neptune, because it was slight. It wasn't like with Neptune, where it was a massive difference in kind of the charts that they had. In this case, it was a little more subtle, but he still theorized it must be a farther planet out with just enough gravity to influence it. And so his observatory set out to find it. Unfortunately, he passed away in the 1910s, and as part of his estate, which went to his widow, there was this issue of who was in charge of the observatory, essentially. So you had this big power struggle that ensued over the authority and everything else. So all the progress towards finding Pluto stopped for about a decade or so, until the legal battle was resolved and everything was kind of straightened out and reorganized in late 1920s. And then they were able to resume. But by this point, right, technology had progressed. And so they had something new that they used that allowed them to compare pictures somewhat quickly, right, and look for a difference in the picture. And so what they decided to do is, instead of trying to mathematically, right, figure this out, much like they did with Neptune, they thought, let's just take pictures of the sky, especially where they think Pluto's at, and we'll just use this new technology to compare the images and see if we see movement anywhere, right? Over, obviously not, one night and then the next night, but over the course of, say, a couple years. And so that's what they set out doing, and sure enough, in 1930, they were able to confirm the existence of Pluto. And so there's two elements to this that we'll come back to as we discuss it later. But number one, you had this power struggle that happened, right? So there's a struggle for power. That's going to be something Pluto's certainly going to represent. Number two, you had this kind of no stone unturned approach, right? We'll just take pictures of everything and then compare and see where we found it, right? We're just going to be extremely thorough. And that's another way in which Pluto tends to operate. It just dredges up everything, good and bad, and then you kind of got to reset from there. So let's look at the astronomy then. What's the astronomy for Pluto? Obviously, it's a generational planet, which means you can't see it with the naked eye. You have to use a telescope, which means it's going to operate in a way that is so far beyond the self, right, that it's coming from a place that we just don't understand. We don't see it. It's too slow. It's too far away. We don't see its effects very perceptibly. Or I don't want to say we don't see its effects, but we don't see it working, if that makes sense. Number two is that it has a very, very long orbit. It's got an orbit of 248 years, far beyond a single human lifespan. And the other thing with its orbit is it's very eccentric. That is, it's very elliptical. And one of the issues with this is it's going to change a couple things. Right? Mars has a pretty elliptical orbit, but it's fairly quick moving. So even though it's elliptical, we still see it kind of moving through multiple signs within one year. In the case of Pluto, though, it's going to spend decades in each sign. So the drasticness with the Pluto elliptical orbit is way different than Mars, and it's much more elliptical than Mars anyway. So with Pluto, you have this situation where the shortest sign, which is Scorpio, is only about 12 to 14 years in terms of how long it stays in the sign. The longest sign, though, is Taurus, which it takes about 40 years to go through. So that's a pretty large difference. And obviously, as it moves from Scorpio to Taurus, it will spend increasingly more time as it goes along. Then obviously from Taurus to Scorpio, it's the reverse, right? Decreasing amount of time. There's a couple implications here. Number one, it means people born with Pluto in different signs are going to experience Pluto transits differently. I'm a millennial, right? I was born with Pluto and Scorpio. That means for me that as it moves through the houses in my chart, it is spending more and more time in each of those houses, which means it's going to get to the Pluto transits later and later as it goes along, to the point where I will never experience the Pluto opposition, right? I won't live long enough. It's going to take too long to get there for me. Somebody that has Pluto and Leo, on the other hand, the boomers, they're already beginning to go through their Pluto opposition. So something that I personally will not experience, the boomers are now beginning to experience, right, as they're moving into their older age. And obviously the oldest boomers are hitting this first, but some of the younger boomers will hit it not too far off either over the next course of the next 20 years. And so different generations hit these different aspects at different times. It also means the variance of Pluto transits is going to be more or less depending on where you have your natal Pluto. And so it's kind of an interesting thing that we see that's, I don't want to say exclusive to Pluto, but certainly very unique to Pluto, at least as far as the planets we've looked at. Some other things. Pluto is a rock, or rock and ice, really, right? With the other planets, the other generational planets, as well as the outer planets, right, from Jupiter onward, they're all gas giants, which means they deal with social things. The qualities they deal with are things we get from society. But in the case of Pluto, it goes back to being rock and ice. And if you look at the solar system, all of the planets that are rock and ice, or really rock, they're all personal to us. And so Pluto is going to have the same element of it's a very personal planet. Even though it's in this kind of far beyond place where it's really far from the self. And so it's a quality that's personal but also yet removed. And that'll make more sense in a moment. Secondly, Pluto, we're not really sure where Pluto kind of came from. There's different theories. But if you look at the layout of the solar system, you have the sun, then you have the inner planets, then you have the asteroid belt after Mars, then you have the gas giants up through Neptune, and then after Neptune you have the Kuiper belt. And then beyond that you have even more like the Oort cloud and stuff. But the Kuiper belt has two phases. The first phase is the stuff that's close enough to Neptune that it is controlled by Neptune's gravity. So everything in the first phase of the Kuiper Belt is under some kind of resonance with Neptune. In the second phase of the Kuiper Belt, everything is outside of the gravitational pull of Neptune. So they have their own orbits. And you see a lot of very crazy orbits that are not on the typical flat plane that all the planets are on, right? And Pluto actually is kind of almost in between these two zones in a way. So if you look at the solar system, what we notice is all of the planets up through Neptune all orbit the sun kind of on a horizontal flat plane, right? They all stay in a line, essentially. But the Kuiper Belt objects, the ones that are in the second phase, sometimes they rotate up and down and sideways and crossways and all kinds of crazy stuff. They have what's called an inclination. The planets on our kind of flat horizontal plane, the inner planets up through Neptune, they all have like 1 to 2 degrees of inclination, right? And that kind of variance along the horizontal plane. The Kuiper Belt objects can sometimes have like 45 or more degrees. Pluto even has 17, so it's already has large parts of its orbit above and below the other planets. Now, Pluto, we don't know if it was originally a Kuiper Belt object or if it was something that was kind of passing through our solar system and was captured by Neptune, or if it was a kind of a small asteroid, dwarf planet, whatever, that was ejected from the inner solar system when it formed and then kind of captured by Neptune. Like I said, there's different theories. We're not really sure. We obviously weren't around when that all happened. But in any event, Pluto's in this weird spot where it's kind of the only thing of the Kuiper Belt objects that's big like Pluto that has been captured by Neptune. And so it occupies this awkward spot where it was pulled away from something, right? It had its original intent, its original fundamental way it was changed by the gravity of Neptune. And as a result, it now has a very eccentric orbit. B, it actually has an orbit that crosses in front of Neptune for a big chunk of it. Or I don't want to say big chunk, but a small chunk of it. And so there's periods of time where Pluto is actually closer to the sun than Neptune is. And because of their 2 to 3 resonance, we talked about this last week, Pluto will never hit Neptune, so we don't have to worry about them colliding. They're kind of locked in. They'll stay that way for millions of years, right? Pluto has no ability to really escape this resonance with Neptune. So it's stuck under Neptune's sway, and it was kind of captured by Neptune, whatever that form originally kind of ended up being. Now, the last thing I want to kind of mention with this, one other thing. This kind of power struggle, if you will, if you look at it this way, in terms of Pluto is captured by Neptune. We also see an interesting dynamic with Pluto's own moon, because it has a moon named Charon. And any of the other planets, you could even look at Earth, they have a moon. The moon's center of gravity will be the center of the planet it's orbiting around. However, that's not the case with Pluto. Pluto's too small compared to Charon, and so Charon doesn't actually have a center of gravity that it orbits around that's the center of Pluto. It's actually off-center a bit, and so it causes this weird wobble within the kind of, as Pluto's kind of moving around in its orbit. Right, so it's even in this weird gravitational battle with its own moon. So it's got two ways in which it's gravitationally kind of stuck, if you will, where it's fighting with something smaller on the one hand, more personal to it, its own moon, but something bigger than it on the other hand, where it has no real, it's kind of stuck with it. It's lost, if you will. The last thing I want to mention is, if you look at the layout as I've kind of described it, right, the outer planets, what do you have? You have Mars, kind of this first personal burst outward into the broader world beyond the self. Then you have Jupiter acting as what you get from that. And then Saturn is the limit. It's the boundary. It's the extent. And as we've discussed with Uranus and Neptune, they kind of echo that. Uranus being this moment of, aha, I've escaped the boundaries. I am free. And this impulse to move beyond the boundaries. And then Neptune's kind of what we get from that. The world of the unknown, the world of, I don't want to say the unreal, but the imaginative, the spiritual, the planes of existence that are not, right, a part of what we know. And then you have Pluto acting as the equivalent to Saturn. But in this case, it's not a limit per se. Because like I said, Pluto is a Kuiper Belt object, right? It was part of that. And that's kind of where most of its orbit kind of puts it, is in the Kuiper Belt. But it's stuck with Neptune, right? It kind of acts as this weird in-between space. And so it's not really a limit per se, but almost more of a consequence. It's kind of the nature of what you must experience by being in this realm, right? Saturn acts as the constraints to how we can operate in the world, both in a very physical sense, but also, right, a social sense, an intellectual sense. It's the kind of limiting things that allow us to exist, that we're stuck with in terms of physical existence. But Pluto is kind of the limits, if you will, consequences, the results of what you get when you live in the world beyond the physical. So what does this all mean then, right? What does Pluto represent? Well, the kind of the major thing to sum up is Pluto's going to represent power. And it's going to represent power struggles. We see this power struggle both with its moon and with Pluto. In one case, it's under the power of other things, where it was fundamentally changed in the nature of how it operates. We'll come back to that. And number two, it's in the struggle to control something else, to have power over something else, to change fundamentally something else. And so that's the power that Pluto represents, the power to change. And I don't mean change in a let me go change my shirt, right? That doesn't change me. That's just an appearance. It's a Venus thing. The change that Pluto represents is fundamental. It's taking something and making it something different. You are no longer the same after a Pluto transit. You cannot go back to what you were before. It is evolution. And so there's a lot of consequences to this, right? This is why Pluto represents, in a way, the limit, as I said. It's what you get when you deal with the things of Uranus, the things of Neptune. When you dare to go beyond, right, you have that impulse to be free, to move past. You're going to get into realms that are sometimes terrifying, sometimes, right, very amazing, incredible, sometimes very deceptively difficult. Sometimes they capture you and trap you. And Pluto is going to essentially be the consequences of these things, how they affect you. Right? Pluto's a personal planet. It's a rock, an ice, like I said. So it's going to be how all of these things in this world beyond, right, Neptunian things, Uranian things, it's how they change you into something else. We're going to look at a couple different examples of this. Let's look at this on the spiritual, right? Neptune's a very spiritual planet. It's how we connect with the spiritual realm. What happens when you have a really spiritual experience? Do you just go on living your life, the same way you always did? No. You talk to people who've done things like ayahuasca or who've had near-death experiences. What happens? They come back with a perspective shift. And obviously those are somewhat more extreme examples. But that's this idea of how Pluto relates to this. They experience something from the beyond. And they can't go back to living a life the way they did before. They have to change. They're forced to change. Right? They are fundamentally different now. And so they have a different perspective. They think different things. They act differently. It flows out into all of their being, right? Because it's a fundamental change of something. Now, in those cases, those are somewhat sudden examples, right? Especially in near-death experience. Would be something that's like a one-time thing where it's, oh, this is suddenly profound. You could say the same thing about, say, a physical accident. You lose a limb. That's a very sudden change. You've evolved, maybe not in a negative, or maybe in a more negative way, but now you have to live fundamentally differently than you did before. Right? So those would be kind of more sudden occurrences of Pluto. But Pluto operates in a very slow manner most of the time, but it can build up from tension, from pressure. When you resist change, it builds up, and then it explodes outward. And so as a result, Pluto can be extreme in its connotations. Why? Because it becomes extreme when things are built up in a way where they're not allowed to change. Because it's pressure building. And if you bottle up pressure, it will always explode at some point. And so that's why Pluto tends to be associated with things that are extreme in their nature. Because those are just ways in which something has built up without any kind of pressure release. Going back to this idea of spiritual change, right? What's another example? Another example would be somebody who has a very religious experience. You see this a lot with new converts, at least I did growing up in Christianity, where somebody who comes from a background that's very, very different, for example, comes in, they have some very spiritual experience, right? Maybe they hit rock bottom in their life or something. And what happens? They have something that they connect with. They connect with God, if you will. And that changes them fundamentally. It changes their outlook. And it's slow at first, little things here and there, and then suddenly it's like this cascade that slowly or even more quickly as time goes on, I'm this different person. I can be this different person. So you come back to them 5 years later and you think, wow, what happened? Right? They found God. They're this wholesome person now, whereas before they were this, sex, drugs, and rock and roll type of person. Right? And that's the nature of Pluto. It takes things that we experience in this beyond, right, from Neptune, and it says, okay, you want to dive into this spiritual world. You want to dive into this world of imagination, of illusion. Here you go. This is the result of that. Here is the consequence of that. Here is how it is going to touch you and how it is going to change you and interact with all the little things inside of you. And the thing is fundamental change requires that it be thorough, right? This is the other aspect we saw with its discovery. They were very thorough in how they found it. They said, let's just take pictures of everything. Leave no stone unturned. And that's the nature of Pluto transits, because you can't fundamentally change something unless you thoroughly rake up all the things that need to be changed, all the things that need to be trimmed out and cut away. A lot of astrologers refer to it as the planet of death and rebirth. And it's not really physical death, it's more metaphorical. But it's this idea that, hey, if you want to change, you have to trim away the things that are unhealthy, right? If you're, say, to use a physical example, if you're overweight, you're obese, you're very unhealthy, right? You don't exercise, you eat terrible, maybe you have heart problems, whatever it is, right? If you want to become healthy, how do you change that? You have to you got to eat better food. You got to start exercising, right? Eat less food. Whatever it is, right? Take medication. Whatever the things you have to do to get from A to B requires a certain level of, first, very obvious physical changes, but then it becomes disciplinary changes, right? Am I sneaking those candy bars when I'm just, lying around watching TV? Or am I staying disciplined and avoiding those urges, those tendencies, right? And that requires conscious effort in some ways. But it's all little things that have to slowly you pick up all these little things and change them, right? You got to leave no stone unturned. Because otherwise the change doesn't really take. Fundamental change also means you have to dive to the deepest parts of something. And so Pluto is going to have a level of depth to it. This is why it's often associated with psychology. Because if you think of who you are at your core, in order to change yourself, you really have to reach down into some of the deep, dark places within our mind, oftentimes the subconscious. Again, this is where it kind of ties back into the Neptune. Neptune is very subconscious. If you go to therapy, even if you're somebody who's pretty the most mentally healthy person, I don't think there's anybody that's perfectly mentally healthy, but even if you're one of the most, mentally well-adjusted people, going to therapy is really helpful because it helps you clear out things you weren't even aware of most of the time, right? You go talk to somebody, they understand how to dig through the ooze, right? Like really sift through things, get to the bottom of things, and dredge up all that kind of hidden stuff from the subconscious and pull it out and say, hey, here's all the crap, right? And some of us have more crap from when we were kids or experiences we had as adults. Some of us have less, but everybody's got stuff. And I'm a big advocate for therapy. I think it's a great thing. But doing things like therapy, and I'm just using this as one example. There's other things you can do, obviously. But going through this deep, dark stuff within inside of us, right? Dredging it up, pulling it up so that we can, cut out the bad habits that we kind of do subconsciously, that we're stuck on because of how we were raised, because of some trauma we have, some PTSD that we got from some event. Right? The way you heal that stuff is by what? You address it, you dig through it, and you recircuit those things within our brains. And that's a very Plutonian way we change. So Pluto's going to represent those deep, dark places, which means Pluto's going to be deep and dark, which is why when you see people that have a very prominent Pluto in their charts, they tend to be very secretive, very private. If you think of the nature of Pluto, it's a personal planet that's very far away. It's invisible. And so Pluto's going to be secretive, and it's going to represent secretive things. And on a collective level, we see this a lot. Plutonian stuff on the collective tends to be secret organizations, the mob, stuff like that. If we think of the dynamic and power of power for a second, not just to change ourselves on a personal level, but if we think of it collectively, right? How does it make sense collectively? Well, if you want to change society, right? If society is one way and you want to get it from point A to point B, you have to have some kind of power to do that. Power to sway people, right? And so this is where that idea of power struggle comes in. Because on the one hand, we're in this struggle to exert our own power over the world around us, as well as to exert it on ourselves sometimes because we want to change ourselves. But we want to change the world around us so we can make it better for ourselves, or so we can make it match the ideal that we want. But then society also has what it idealizes. And so it tries to change things. And so Pluto represents that ability to change it. So wherever we see Pluto, the sign it's in, things like that, is going to show where the power lies. Right now, Pluto's in Aquarius. Where does that mean power lies? It means it isn't centralized. It's eclectic. It's diffused. And this is going to be seen in terms of power playing out in multipolarity, bureaucracy, possibly. Some people would say democracy, but that tends to be more the mob rule aspect of it. But that's kind of the nature of what we'll witness for the next 20 years, is where power will tend to lie or kind of move towards. So collectively, we see Pluto operate in the power to change society. So Pluto cycles deal with this societal change and where power is wielded, how power is wielded, and where that power changes society. And that, conversely, right, influences us. Society has a big sway over how we can operate. We live within governments for the most part. We don't live in anarchy. And so governments, as they have power, or corporations, right, or even families, they have power over us. There are things in life we run into that have more power than we do. And so they force us to change. Right? Say you have a business, you're selling cookies, and they pass a law and say you're not allowed to use, this kind of, you can't use chocolate chips anymore. That's going to fundamentally change how you do business, especially if chocolate chip cookies are your best-selling cookie. Right? And that's a very basic example, probably unrealistic example, but that's the kind of power society can kind of inflict on you. And then it becomes the power struggle. Can I fight this some way? Can I get around this to continue being who I am, or do I have to fundamentally change? And so this is the power struggle we see with Pluto, both personally and in terms of the collective. So one other thing is Pluto takes time to work. It's a slow grind, right? Because evolution is not quick. You don't just evolve overnight. It's a slow process. Little things got to get churned up so that they can slowly change. And so never expect Pluto transits as you have them to be slow or to be quick things. Always expect them to be slow. But they're not something to be fearful of. I think a lot of people new to astrology, I certainly was this way when I first started learning, get really terrified of Pluto transits because they call it the planet of death and rebirth, right? It's kind of a terrifying thing. And so people think of it as this scary planet. But really what we have to remember is Pluto is about change. It's about transforming. And so if you can embrace that as we have transits, even difficult ones. Pluto's squaring my sun currently. So I'm experiencing this. But if you can embrace it and understand, okay, this part of my life has to change during this transit. I can resist it. And what's going to happen? The tension and the pressure will build up. I will run into things that will continue apply that pressure to me, asking me to change. If I resist it, it's going to explode. And it will come in a way that is much more violent and apocalyptic in its nature. But if you embrace it and say, okay, I'm going to change, then you can work with it. Then we can say, okay, now I can evolve. Now I can evolve in a way that's healthy and, honestly, easier to deal with. So Pluto isn't a planet to be terrified of, but it is a planet to be given a healthy dose of respect for the kind of power it can wield. Because it can be hard to deal with, right? We see it in natal charts a lot, where Pluto is really tough when it's kind of mucking up a chart. Why? Because it represents this power struggle, this change. Something's being fundamentally changed in a way where it has to deal with power. And that's a tough thing to deal with, because on the one hand let me rephrase this. If you look at a power struggle, there's always two parties, which means it's always me and somebody else. And that can be really hard to deal with, especially if the other person has the upper hand. And so when you look at a natal chart that has Pluto aspects, a lot of times the Pluto aspects show a part of life where we had some kind of power struggle going on, and then we had to learn to react to that. So negative Pluto aspects, the square, the opposition, even the conjunction, tend to be really intense, really heavy in their application, because they deal with something that is inherently deep and dark and heavy, because it's asking for transformation. Pluto leads to extremes because as things build up, right, they get to extreme levels before they explode. And so Pluto tends to take things to the extreme, because that is simply an ignoring of change until it becomes too much. Now, Pluto is, I think I mentioned this, but it's a secretive planet, right? Because it's far away. I'm trying to think. Let me look at my notes real fast. So I think that's the main gist of Pluto. It's about power struggle, right? Our struggle for our own power to change the world, to change ourselves, as well as the struggles we deal with, the power that other people have over us and how we handle that. And it's not just power for the sake of authority. I want to be very clear. Authority and power are completely different. Authority simply says, I have charge over people. I can tell them what to do. But telling somebody what to do is not changing them, per se. It's not changing things, per se. It could just simply be managing something, organizing something. Power is the ability to affect change, fundamental change. Right? You take something from A to B, and that's what Pluto represents. So when you have Pluto and Saturn combined, then you get power mixed with structure. Pluto and Sun combined, you get power mixed with authority. And Saturn can be authority figures in some ways too. But Pluto represents this idea of power to change things, which means it's going to represent how things evolve, which means in our charts, when we have aspects to it, it's going to show periods of time when we evolve, things that are applying influence on us to force us to evolve in some way. Evolve our way of thinking, our way of being, our way of acting, our way of believing, our way of loving, feeling, whatever it is. Right? Pluto is asking us to evolve, to change, fundamentally. And societally, it's how things evolve over time as well. The last thing is Pluto's tied to Neptune, which means ideals, imagination, spirituality. Those are all things that, as we connect to them, are inherently going to change us. You have a spiritual experience, it's going to change you. You get lost in addiction because you are imagining the world as something else, or you want to get lost in the fantasy of something that is going to fundamentally change you. You set your sights on some new ideal of who you should be, or what the world should be. That is going to fundamentally change you, because it's going to force you to act in alignment with that ideal. Alternatively, it could be an ideal of the world is being enacted upon you and asking you to fundamentally change. It's always two sides of that coin. And change is really hard because it requires that we dredge up everything to see what works and what doesn't, what needs to die off, so that the new things can be birthed, right? And so that's why Pluto has this very ego death kind of way to it. Now, in terms of signs, modern astrology ascribes signs to the different outer or generational planets. In the case of Pluto, Pluto is said to rule Scorpio. I think this fits in some ways. I don't personally use the generational planets as rulers of any signs, but if you do, that's fine, as long as you can make it work in practice, right? Never use something simply because it sounds right or sounds good. Because if it doesn't work, then that's, who cares what it sounds like? It doesn't work. But Pluto is said to rule Scorpio, or that's what it's ascribed to. And Scorpio wants to be in control. It's a very chaotic, turbulent, emotional sign. And Scorpio is very intense, and it fixates on things. And it wants to get really intimate with things. And Pluto, naturally, is very deep. It represents the deepest core of things, right? Which is obviously very akin to intimacy. Now, Pluto's about evolution. Scorpio's not really about change, per se. Scorpios, they can change quite a bit because they're a water sign. But the change for Scorpio is kind of more like it freezes in a state. It holds on to an emotion. And when that finally is kind of damaged in a way where it has to let go of it, it's like it melts and then refreezes in a different method. So there is certainly there's certainly a strong level of connection there, I think. If Scorpio is ruled by Pluto, that means Pluto would be in detriment, in exile, in Taurus. Taurus is a fixed earth sign ruled by Venus. That would make a ton of sense because Taurus is about stability, right? Safety. It's about holding on to things, keeping them nice and stable and fixed. And that's not what Pluto's about. Pluto's about change. It's about evolution. You can't do that in a sign that's about keeping things the way they are, in a very, very rigid, kind of earthy feel. So, makes total sense. As of now, I've never actually seen anything regarding the exaltation or fall for Pluto, so I'm not going to speak to those at the moment. But yeah, I would say amongst the generational planets, certainly the rulership for Scorpio, and therefore detriment in Taurus, makes a lot of sense, at least for Pluto, at least on a theoretical level. It's not perfect by any means in terms of its kind of analog to Scorpio, but it's certainly very resonant. One last thing is regarding the transits for Pluto. I think I mentioned this towards the beginning of the podcast, so I apologize if this is slightly repetitive, but it takes time to move through the different signs, but it's varying, right? And so that means the different generations where you have it in your chart, you're going to see different aspects to it. By and large, most people should hit Pluto square kind of late 30s, early 40s, and then you should hit the Pluto trine, I believe. Gosh, it's a much wider range, but I believe it's going to be, for most people, kind of in your 60s, maybe 50s, 60s. Could be wrong on that one. And then the opposition is very much dependent on where you have Pluto natally, or what sign it's in natally, because that's too variant. One other thing too with that is Pluto is very connected to Neptune, and so the Pluto-Neptune cycle is something that I think on a societal level is very interesting to look at. Certainly not going to discuss it much in this video. But for the sake of where we're at, we have been in the Pluto-Neptune sextile within a kind of wide-ish orb, essentially since the 1930s. And it is going to continue until 2040, abouts, where it stays within an 8-degree or less orb, and currently it's actually in a very tight orb, right? It's about 3. It's going to tighten up to about 0 over the next coming years. And so pretty much everyone alive has Pluto sextile Neptune as part of their charts within, like I said, a wide orb. You could have it as, far as 10 degrees. but it should be 10 or less for pretty much everyone alive. So that is one thing for most people where Neptune is going to be involved in their Pluto, at least in a very slight capacity. So that's everything. Again, to sum up, Pluto represents power. It's the power to change, to evolve. And it's kind of the consequence of what we get with dealing with things that are, right, beyond reality. Whether it's imagination, ideals, whether it's spirituality, whether it's the subconscious. Whenever we dig into these deep, dark places that are kind of, again, outside the realm of the physical world, we're going to inherently change. We're going to fundamentally change who we are, and that's what Pluto represents, this ability to change things and the power that is required to do so. So I hope you enjoyed. I think from here we are going to move on to, probably the houses. I don't know. I'm going to take a look at a couple different things and we'll go from there. So again, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Thank you for listening. I am a professional astrologer, so if you're interested in a reading, you can always reach out to me. Either go to my website, jdastrology.com, or you can send me an email, james@jdastrology.com. So again, thank you for listening and have a great week.